Good morning again. I'm Reverend Nikki Ashwood from the World Council of Churches, and I'm the Program Executive for the Just Community of Women and Men. The problem of femicide, intentional killing of women because of their gender, has been with us for ages, for far too long. Current statistics indicate that approximately 137 women are killed each day because of their gender in cases of intimate partner violence. That would account for almost 60% of all the countries represented as independent countries, 1 per day. Those statistics are worrisome, especially as we begin this season of being intentional in consideration of awareness, moving toward accountability as partners working to end sexual and gender-based violence. Today, with our partners from the World YWCA, the Lutheran World Federation, ACT Alliance, and us, your hosts at the World Council of Churches, we wish to invite you to join us in not just thinking about the problem, but moving from awareness to accountability, as is asked of each of us through this year's theme of the 16 days. We have with us speakers from Europe, the Pacific, Asia, and Africa, who will be speaking from their respective perspectives and who will later join each of you as we break out in small groups to discern how we might go forward. So if you came just to hear and not get involved, we are challenging you to change your perspective so that in short order, each of us may be part of the change that we wish to see in the world. Of course, today is Thursday, and so we also celebrate or recognize or commemorate Thursdays in Black. It is a time for solidarity, joining together. It is a time for resistance, to say no to rape and violence. It's a time for hope, and it is a time for reflection. So I invite us to pause for a moment as we seek to pray. And as we pause, let us, each of us, if we're able in the chat, to perhaps mention the name of someone who has either survived or been a victim of sexual and/or gender-based violence. And we pause to place those persons before God's throne. Let us pray. For those many victims of sexual and gender-based violence, Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. As we continue, I wish to introduce to us the speakers who are with us at present. From Greece, we have Francesca Altazeni. Francesca is a graduate of the Department of Greek Philology, who has volunteered at YWCA of Athens for 7 years. She's a board member with the YWCA of Athens and an executive committee member of the YWCA Greece, which is dedicated to overcoming violence against women. The YWCA's work in Greece includes advocacy and activism, family law, COVID-19 crisis response, research on the impact of gender-based violence and countering femicide. They have worked with the Presidency of the Republic of Greece to host workshops on femicide during the Kagogiannis Foundation She's Gone exhibition. During these years, Francesca has participated in programs for children organized by the local chapter of the YWCA, and she's an active member of its communication team. We have Faye Simanjutak, who is the founder of Ruma Faye, a nonprofit which began in 2013, working to eradicate child sexual abuse, trafficking, and exploitation through 3 programs: prevention, rescue, and rehabilitation. Through her work, Faye has been honored to receive recognition, including being mentioned in Forbes Indonesia's 30 under 30 list of 2020 and being an International Children's Peace Prize finalist in 2017. Most importantly, Faye has led Ruma Faye to open its Safe House in 2016, which works directly with victims of such crimes. As of March 2020, they've assisted in the recovery and the safety and protection of over 140 girls. Is Kuleni here? Kuleni Fikru is a project manager of Safe from Irregular Migration Project with 3 years of experience in rehabilitating women returnees economically and psychologically in advocating against gender-based violence. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in nursing and a 2nd degree in gender health and theology from Ethiopian Graduate School of Theology. She's a wife and mother of 2 boys. Nontando Hedebe. Dr. Nontando Hedebe is a Catholic post-colonial feminist theologian who currently serves as the international coordinator of Side by Side, which is hosted by We Will Speak Out, South Africa. She's an active member of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, a writer and an agitator for gender-just societies. Reverend Dr. O. Kehinde Babarinde. Reverend Dr. Kehinde Babarinde is a National Director, Education, Dialogue, and Value System Initiatives and Adjunct Lecturer for the West Africa Theological Seminary, Lagos, Nigeria. Babarinde belonged to the Interfaith Group in Lagos State, Nigeria. He was the president of Lagos Central Baptist Conference for 10 years and served as a member of the executive committee of the Christian Council of Nigeria, CCN, and that of the Nigerian Baptist Convention. In an ad hoc capacity, he has served as chairman, Triennial Conference Committee of CCN in 2016. Dr. Babarinde has participated and facilitated at ecumenical interfaith dialogue and leadership conferences. Stephanie Dunn. She is a lawyer by profession and passionate about advocating for women's human rights. Stephanie is currently the legal and advocacy officer for the Fiji Women's Crisis Center. She's part of the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development through its Pacific Sub-Regional Committee, Regional Council, and the Program Organizing Committee of the Feminist Law and Practice Program. Prior to joining this, she was with the Legal Aid Commission for over 3 years in Fiji, where she acquired an extensive background in litigation within the family, civil, and criminal law jurisdiction. She's also an accredited mediator, a proud feminist and activist. Let us welcome our panelists. Our panelists will now share a little bit about their work in about a minute or two and how their work coincides and intersects with issues related to femicide, the killing of women, and/or acts of violence against women in their contexts. Faye, Notando, Stephanie, we'll take you first.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much, everyone, for having me. I'm so excited, not necessarily excited to talk about the topic, but excited to share the stage with such incredible women and people who have done great things across the region. I suppose I only have 1 to 2 minutes, so I'm going to make it quick. Like was mentioned earlier in our short introductions, my name is Faye Juntak. I work to eradicate child trafficking and child prostitution in Indonesia, specifically working in anti-child sex trafficking. So the majority of the cases we work with are with women and girls, usually girls as young as 6 and 7, actually, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, who have become victims of sexual exploitation, victims of sexual abuse. And what we see is a lot of the cases, the majority of the cases that we handle, is that the perpetrators are generally those closest to the victim. So that's a father, that's an uncle, and it's a lot of times facilitated by the women in their lives as well, in which the wives don't want to speak up and the sisters just look on while it happens, just grateful that it's not them. And so we see there's this extremely harmful patriarchal structure that not only culturally, but actually institutionally oppresses the women and children in Indonesia, in which it's not only hard to identify the cases, but also hard to report it. And this leads to a lot of cultural shame, a lot of victim blaming that occurs within the community level, within the village level. That's extremely hard to combat. That it's not something that can be solved through 1 or 2 speeches, but it has to be a structural, long-term education plan that we have to, initiate through collaboration with the children there, with the people there. And so a lot of our work at Rumah Faye is, it'll extend for more than 6-7 years in one region, because we believe that for there to be long-term change, the people themselves have to be included in that change. They have to be part of it. They have to be the grassroots. So realizing that our role as, an organization is not to make the change, is not to be the voice of the voiceless, but it's to amplify the voices that are already there. Realizing that even though we are Indonesians also, even though, for example, I'm a woman also, I don't have the same experiences. And so seeing these cases and coming straight to the areas that we impact, we realize that there are so many nuances to the topic, where a lot of the girls that had previously become victims of sexual exploitation, of sexual abuse, become much more vulnerable to other types of abuse, to other types of trafficking. And that's when femicide comes in, that a lot of the women become especially vulnerable to not only to sometimes violence and sometimes murder, because they are put in extremely vulnerable situations.
Thank you so much, Faye.
That's a little bit about our work. Thank you.
I'm going to jump. I'm flipping it just a wee bit, and I'm going to jump to Stephanie, who has been nodding a lot throughout what you're saying. Stephanie, as you have been nodding, you're coming from the Pacific, and most people's image of the Pacific is of the lei and the hula and this very sweet and passive community that is just 2 shades short of paradise. And we often forget that there were snakes in paradise. Why do you agree with what Faye has been saying?
With what Faye said in terms of the patriarchal structure that you have in Indonesia is quite similar to that in the Pacific, because we have a patriarchal structure, and it creates that barrier even for women to come forward. And even when they do, it creates a barrier for those service providers, the way that they respond to the survivors. And that creates that mistrust, and a lot of the survivors do not actually want to come forward. And it creates that barrier, and it worsens even during times of crisis. So for our organization, the Fiji Women's Crisis Center, we're an organization that has been established for almost 37 years now. We were established in 1984, and our key primary mandate is to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls, not only in Fiji, but in the Pacific. We do this through a very comprehensive and very robust program that not only focuses on responding to them, but also the prevention work. And much of what Faye had highlighted is also what we do. It's about creating those change agents in our communities, letting them be the, I'd like to give an example. quite recently during COVID with the restrictions, the movements were not allowed. And as you all know, when movements are restricted, survivors are trapped in their homes with the perpetrators. That escalates the violence at home. And what it also causes is that survivors are unable to access the services because the perpetrator is around them. And our counselors were on call 24 hours, 7 days a week. Because we're also a counseling service, and it's one that is given confidentially, it's GBV counseling and it's crisis counseling, and it's confidential and free to our survivors. We're not only focusing on responding to them and ensuring that they get the appropriate services in a timely manner, but also focusing on how we can create the change in the communities, engaging with faith-based organizations, and that's what we have done very closely with House of Sarah in Fiji, the Anglican Church, and they've done marvelous work in that space. It's about creating that space where women can come forward, where women can speak up about this situation, because at the end of the day, we need to give them the tools to be able to come out of the situations that they are. And part of that is doing your education, community education. We also have a male advocacy for women's human rights. It's about engaging men and understand, for them to unpack gender, for them to understand gender, as well as understanding the privileges that they were born in. How can they use that to improve the situation of women? We also have a regional program where we reach out, and what we speak about now, we also engage other regional organizations, regional countries, to see how EVO work can also be inputted into their countries as well. And at the end of the day, like I said, each one of us has our programs, but what's most important is about contextualizing it to the countries that you're from. And for Fiji, just like the global statistics for domestic violence is 1 in 3 women affected by intimate partner sexual violence. But for Fiji and the Pacific, it's 2 out of 3. And that's quite a large amount, considering, especially for a country like ours, we're barely 1 million. And yet our statistics say that 64% of women experience intimate partner violence, whether it's sexual or physical. And that is very scary for a country that has barely even 1 million people. And just since 2014 to 2021, we've lost 39 women. In 2019, 10 women, we lost 10 women to femicide, and all to the hands of their partners. And what we've also seen on the ground is when women are deciding to leave those violent relationships, that is when they're at higher risk. That is when it's really dangerous for them. So getting timely response, or getting timely services available for them is very important, because it's, to us, it may mean a second late or a minute late, but for them, every second counts, and it's a big difference between life and death. And that's why I was nodding my head when Faye was talking, because we have similar experiences. It may be different the way it is, but it's quite similar in terms of the patriarchal structure, how we're responding to it, how we're going about it. So that's a little bit about the Fiji Women's Crisis Center and what we do. Because apart from our responsive, thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
I'm going to bring you back in a few, but Nontando and Kihinde, I note that these days, both Nigeria and South Africa have been making the headlines in very unfavorable ways. In fact, if Kuleni is here, I would also bring her in the conversation at this time, because if I'm not mistaken, Kuleni is coming from Ethiopia, and it would be interesting to get an African perspective, each of you speaking for a minute about your work. Nontando, recently South Africa was actually named as the global place that is most unsafe for women alone. I know that you have been working to eradicate violence on the sidelines long before you came into this position at Side by Side. Can you tell us a bit more about the South African experience? And Kehinde, in a country where kidnapping is the order of the day, help us to understand what happens in Nigeria. And Kuleni, when you come, we know that there is a big crisis in Ethiopia right now that no one wants to speak about, especially in relation to its impact on women. Tell us about what you do in 1 minute before we bring others into the conversation. Nontando?
Yes, thank you very much. And the statistics are frightening that we have the highest sexual violence in the world, the rape statistics. and they've been exacerbated by COVID-19. But I want us to understand the context that is rooted in this high levels of violence. And the first, that this is a context where 90% plus of the population identifies themselves as associated to a religion. This is a context where religion was used to perpetuate colonial and apartheid violence against Black bodies. This is a context that is a legacy of the colonial power hierarchies of racism, classism, homophobia, and all kinds of, and sexism. So when we understand that context, because things just don't happen randomly, they are rooted in a particular context. And so when, as I said, we focus on really dismantling the religious narrative and interpretations because of the legacy that we have. Unfortunately, the government has also come on board, and they've set out a national strategic plan, because the president said that the second pandemic, in addition to COVID-19, is the pandemic of gender-based violence and femicide. And we have witnessed horrific incidents of femicide and all kinds of attacks on women's bodies. And so we are we're going back and saying, we have 90% plus persons affiliated to churches and mosques. And we are saying the first entry point is to really address those narratives and beliefs in the sacred text that create a climate in which male superiority and female subordination is part of the norm, because these are the root causes of gender-based violence and femicide. And so we will speak out, and the Faith Initiative, we have embarked on a program of working with faith leaders in this area of empowering, of looking at sacred texts in a liberating way. We already have a legacy of Kairos theology, and now we are lifting it up to deal with gender-based issues, and also to recognize that the perpetrator, nothing about us without us, that both the perpetrator and the survivors of violence needs to be at the center of everything that we do and inform our processes and what we do. And so even there, that voice is being amplified. And we're also looking at toxic masculinities, saying that there's something that has happened to the way in which masculinities are understood. And so we're challenging cultural, we're challenging sacred text masculinities. So we're seeing this as a multi-pronged response, so that we really get to the root and the functioning and the combination of factors that make it, that normalize and allow for gender-based violence to characterize our society. And so in joining forces, and particularly the religious forces where majority of the people are, this is the sphere of intervention that we keep at it, program after program, message after message, and will continue until piece by piece we dismantle the ideologies, that the patriarchal aspects of our religion, so that we go back to Ubuntu, we go back to the dignity of the human person, we go back to other means of relationships where violence is not a criteria or a go-to alternative. So we are passionate about what we do. We have a vision, and we know that this is systemic. It's something that we need to keep on doing day in and day out. And so we really are working on those issues together with government, together with churches, and we will not stop.
Thank you so much. Dr. Kehinde, speak to us about Nigeria. And as you speak, please remember to unmute. Can you share with us some of the work that you're doing in Nigerian context?
You're welcome, and I'm so glad to be here. I feel like our sister that spoke from the South African perspective, I commend you. particularly your concept of patriarchal system that is more of Old Testament, and we may have to go back in our theological institutions to the area of biblical theology that is Christ-centered, where women could use their hair and oil to rub the feet of Jesus without him taking advantage of them. The statistics are not different from the three major countries chosen, and I will centralize on Nigeria later. We have 52 to 57% rate in an average base from 94, Nigeria to 37, and Ghana to about 58. And then we have these cases that are reported. The victims are about 30 to 31.
We seem to have lost Dr. Kehinde. As we wait for Dr. Kehinde to return, I invite Francesca to join us in the conversation. Francesca. Okay, please continue.
Are common in Nigeria. All right. Drugs, kidnapping, there are kidnappers in Nigeria, and these are common. Political thuggery, incessant strike in the education sector. We also have a case of xenophobia where women are also at disadvantage. And this is also, wow.
I think when you're sharing the screen, we're having less ability to hear you, Dr. Kehinde.
Wow, but are you hearing me now?
We're hearing you now, keep going.
All right. The banditry, then the fetish system in Nigerian system, in some part of Nigeria, in terms of killing female folks for diabolical means to make money. These are also, it may sound as myth in some setting, but it's reality. In our own setting, people use the part of the body of women for rituals. And then we have religious fundamentalism that relegates women to instruments. The COVID-19 pandemic brought restrictions to the house, like our first speaker mentioned, where we don't have availability of security apparatus and systems. And so there are loss of economy, even to these children. And so they have to make means. In the process of making ends meet, some of them lose their lives inevitably. Then the impact on the family and the sorrow, we see loss of family members, grief and trauma. The Christian Council of Nigeria has a trauma center in partnership with other faiths in Jos in Nigeria to handle those who have lost their lives, their daughters. Imagine this going to Baptist High School recently in April and kidnapping hundreds of children, and majority of them are ladies. They are raped, tortured, and some are killed. Leah Sharif is a case in hand, the Chibok girls, and so the girl has not returned. It's only Leah Sharif that is a Christian that we can talk of. What about other girls that have been killed because of, and their loss of economy? Now the hostility continues. Because
thank you so much. Thank you so much, Doc. We're going to bring you back in a minute. I invite Francesca to share, and I do need you to remain, folks, within the minute, or we won't be able to have that second round of conversation. Dr. Babarinda, can you stop sharing your screen, please?
All right.
Hello again. In Greece, one of the most important problem for a woman is violence and domestic violence, which is secret for many women. So YWCA of Greece, which is one of the oldest women's voluntary organizations, try to raise awareness to women to protect themselves from especially their partners and husbands. The second very important thing for us is to make the notion femicide legitimate and to be recognized by the authorities as an autonomous crime. For these reasons, we have a variety of programs and partnerships with both private and public foundations. YWCA of Greece started a 2-year program called ANA, with which we try to raise awareness about sex-based violence, and we make many online campaigns and projects and webinars for this reason. Now with the foundation in Rhodos, we made a board game for based on the sex-based violence. We participate in workshops with other voluntary organizations, and the most important for us now is to create a portal with information that will be organized for the woman to have access in organizations to protect them. Furthermore, the recognition of the notion of femicide is very important for us because until now 13 women have been killed from during the pandemic this year, and by
this year 2021,
yes, 13 women now have been killed by their partners, and these crimes are not recognized as femicides, but as domestic violence outcome. And it's very sad because we lose one every month, and
one a month,
and they are described as crimes of passion and love, which is not the real.
Okay, thank you so much, Francesca. Is Kuleni still here? Kuleni, are you able to join us? If not, I'm going to invite all the panelists to join me on this screen for a moment quickly. And let's talk a little bit about the role of culture, which Nontando and Kehinde has raised. We can look a little bit about the regional and national, local response to the issue of sexual and gender-based violence that Francesca, Faye, and Stephanie have mentioned. I'm very intrigued by the concept of a board game because that suggests that you are taking an approach which invites people to start the conversation from as early as childhood. How did you conceptualize this board game? And have any of the others of you ever used a board game or any form of game or song or role play to help to reduce the scope and spate of violence? Francesca?
Maybe I'll oh,
okay, go for it, Stephanie.
Sorry, I was just going to say we don't have board games, but what we do have is community education awareness programs that is tailor-made when you're going into communities, and especially if you're dealing with children. We actually have the good touches and bad touches. So it's a little color out pamphlet that you can give, ICT material that you can give to children so that they're aware of what touches they consider that they're comfortable with, touches that if they're not comfortable with it, then who can they get in contact with? So it also gives them a little bit of information on the organizations that you can reach out to. And part of our programs as well is using like little dolls, showing out places where people are not supposed to touch. Also as part of culture, you know, for the Pacific, we're people that love to hug, love to kiss on their cheeks. And sometimes because of this cultural context, we growl at little children. We growl at them and tell them, you're supposed to hug auntie, you're supposed to hug uncle, you're supposed to kiss them. But what happens is perpetrators, under the guise of family or under the guise that they're close family friends, uses or abuses this particular connection to then abuse the child. So we always encourage parents as well as in communities that it's okay for children to say, no, I don't want to hug them, regardless of how close of a relationship they have. And no, I don't want to go with them just because that's my granduncle or uncle. We encourage the communities to start listening to children, that it's no longer the culture where children are seen and never heard. It's about time that we also encourage them to speak up as well. So that's also part of what we do.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I saw Faye and Nontando nodding in agreement. And I still want to hear a little bit more about the board game. But as Faye and Nontando come in, Francesca, help us to think through how it is that you encourage perhaps the good touch, bad touch conversation through the board game, or any other way in which you encourage the safety of our children through this context.
It's the theme of the board game is about sex-based violence. So through this game, children know what violence against their partner is, how to be protected. And this is the concept of the board game. It is now in the first stages. It's complete, but it's not commonly known now. We start to implement it in kids in school, in a small number of schools not yet. And when we will have results, we will try to make it commonly known. It's now our latest project regarding the touches to children, so the abuse of children. We have a program which is called 41 Travels, which is about the rights of children, and the children through this program get to know their rights and what to do in difficult
Awesome.
situations.
Thank you. Nontando and Faye?
Oh, I love this concept of the board game. I hope you can post it for us so that we have access. Because, you know, like with COVID, people are indoors. So any way that we can educate through something that is many people are familiar with, yeah, I just love it. And I just want to pick up on culture and the way in which, you know, and you can see, I just want to look at proverbs. You know, there are proverbs that say that, you know, what happens in the home must stay in the home. So, you know, so women are almost socialized to keep quiet about violence and that is happening because of these proverbs. And then also, another proverb which says that, a woman is available to her husband at all times. And so we see that in some of the teachings, there's kind of like, create a context in which women's bodies can be violated by male, and it will be okay. And also sometimes there is the abuse of culture. And I think that's what Stephanie also spoke about, like the culture of ulobola, the bride price. It was never meant to be a commercial exchange. Women were not meant to be bought so that they are owned. That whole concept has been commercialized, and almost giving the husband the right to do what they want with their wife. But that was never the intention of the culture. It was really to bond the two families, but it has been abused. So a lot of the abuse of the culture in a commercialized, colonized space is one of the things that have really, really damaged the cultural contribution. When you think about Ubuntu, if we use that lens to determine our practices, then all of the things that are happening would really either be eradicated or replaced. So that combination of even the inherited patriarchy from colonialism and apartheid actually cultivated the patriarchy that wasn't harmful, and really reinforced it to be what it is through the laws, colonial laws, and all kinds of things. And then the other group that I forgot to mention that is part of the church's response is the violation and rape of LGBTI people in the name of culture, in the name of being un-African. But the dehumanizing of somebody's children as a portion of our community cannot go unchallenged, because when we dehumanize one portion, we are saying that we are dehumanizing people, and that's not who we are.
Thank you, Namtando. Before we continue with the panel with me, I know that Reverend Dr. Emmanuel Gabriel finally made it into the space, and he was the original moderator. And I just saw Kuleni. Kuleni, where did you turn? Every time I think we have Kuleni with us, she disappears again. So Dr. Gabriel, Reverend Dr. Emmanuel Gabriel, can you tell us in less than a minute about your work in Nigeria? We can't have you moderate the session at this point, but we would love to hear in less than a minute, just a bit about what you do. Kehinde mentioned ritual practices that includes the murder of women, and we'd love to hear a little bit more about that. But before we hear that, just tell us a bit about the work you do, after which Faye will continue to speak. Kuleni, if you're here, we are ready to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I am really sorry. I apologize to everyone for coming late. It is because of my inability to connect. Over here. I am sorry about that. And then before I go again, I am Reverend Emmanuel, not Reverend Dr. Emmanuel. Please, thank you. Here in Nigeria, I coordinate the Symbols of Hope Project, which is an initiative of the Lutheran World Federation. And basically, we are focused on addressing issues of irregular migration and human trafficking. And we provide social support, mental health support, and livelihood support also to aid to facilitate reintegration of the recent migrants. We basically, in most cases, we have found out that women are in the majority of about 20% or 5% of the vulnerable, most vulnerable of these women. So we take care of them, we bring them together, provide them social, and then help them to get back.
Emmanuel, if you try turning your video off, maybe we will hear you a little bit better. The sound is scratchy.
Oh, sorry about that.
Much better. Keep going now.
Thank you. Now, okay, the Symbols of Hope project is facilitating reintegration of returned migrants who are mostly women. Out of every 10 that will migrate in an irregular way will be women. And in most cases, this happens because of gender-based violence or gender discriminations in their various areas, or families and communities where they live. And the Symbols of Hope is basically trying to restore hope and give them their place in society by advocating for the right thing, all inclusiveness, and then the true biblical interpretation of the Bible when it comes to gender issues. All of this.
Thank you so much, Reverend Emmanuel. Faye and then Kehinde.
Thank you.
For us, our work is really child-based. I truly believe that to find the solution for any issue, we have to integrate and we have to involve the most vulnerable populations in finding that solution. And that's why a lot of our work is focused on child empowerment. So we don't have board games, but what we do instead is we supplement basic reproductive health education classes with other more fun activities. So things like creative classes and cooking classes. We work together with local artists and local chefs to set up not only one-time kind of trainings, but also a curriculum of sorts that will last, let's say, 6 months for the kids to learn, for example, baking skills. So every week, once a week, they'll be able to bake together with us. And then after that, we'll do a lesson about reproductive health or something like that, or about child trafficking. So we really try to do kind of hands-on skills as well. And luckily, there's also kind of a dual benefit from that, where 2 of the kids who turns out to be very, very talented young bakers, they got to do like a little apprenticeship with the chef who taught them. So it's unfortunately we don't have board games, but that's something I'm very, very interested in. But yeah, we do more activity-based things. So that creative class of drawing and making art out of recycled materials or baking is also a big thing.
So one of the ways you're proposing that we could think about moving toward mitigating the scope of violence is through creativity and ensuring that people are able to utilize their gifts and skills to be somewhat independent should they need to be finding avenues of escape.
Correct.
Kehinde, speak to me about ritual killings. I know that for many of us, this is a weird and strange concept because it's not common in our parts of the world. Well, not in mine, except that I have a vague memory of this concept of a Blackheart man when I was a child, who we were told would turn up after dark and would take our organs to do all sorts. Is that what ritual killing for body parts is? Help us to understand what this is.
It may sound like a myth, but the truth is that there is this belief in African traditional culture that there are mystical powers, and these powers could be manipulated to a kind of bring money or prosperity to an individual. I've never done it, but it has been said, and it is believed by many. And so in the light of that, there is the belief that parts of the body of women, by God of nature, a woman's part of the body, are instruments for such metaphysical means. And we preach against that. And so what we do is we try to emphasize sexual purity within the school system in secondary schools, and preach against bullying, advocacy against bullying, and emphasize sexual purity, because you come from the positive dimension of orientation to correct the evil. And then hard work, emphasis on value system. Our sister from South Africa has always ignited me in terms of culture. Let me emphasize another cultural practice that the institutions, the church-based institutions, FBOs, may have to also work in. Inheriting widows. You know, where poverty strikes and a widow is caged in the house without food, without money, if the widow did not want to be inherited, the widow may starve to death.
Wow.
Or be constrained. You know, people can starve. People would rather prefer to die. So there are also death and suicide that may be ignited by pain and sorrow. And so these are not reported cases. Just like we have said, that there are several, about 23% of cases of missing people, murdered, violence that are not reported at all. And so when in the cultural setting, they emphasize that the widow has to be inherited, and the widow against her wish prefers even to starve to death or to even commit suicide by any means, these are also femicide, because you may think it is a suicide. No, it is a kind of a response of pain to the womanhood, the self-dignity of that woman. And so the church must also rise, like what Council of Churches is doing, to keep on emphasizing, and it's not one-off, like our sister has said, it's not a one-off thing. We'll keep on mobilizing, like in Nigeria, the Christian Council of Nigeria, the AACC has always done, the EDAPI of the Nigerian Baptist Convention, a member of the World Council, have been a lot in terms of emphasizing all these practices that are inimical to womanhood and the dignity of our mothers.
I want to pull that first piece of your response, Kehinde, where you said that there is a concept of mystical powers associated with women. Stephanie, Faye, Francesca, Nontando. Could it be that the problem with women is rooted in the fact that we seem to have mystical powers, and that may be the root cause of the violence being perpetrated? I also note that Nontando raised the also taboo issue of violence against sexual minorities, so to speak, of the LGBTQ community. I want to zero in first on the concept of the mystique of women being the cause of our demise. And I invite any of the women to respond to that. And then we can pick up on the issue of LGBTQ, violence against LGBTQ community, and what the church or the religious groups ought to do. So any of you, make this your final word. Speak to me about the mystique of women and this being a contributing factor in their demise.
I think before they had that, let me just chip in this guide. Even the Mariology, which evangelicals may not emphasize, Mariology in Catholic theology is an emphasis on the adoration of womanhood.
Thank you
everything
so
about
very much.
womanhood is great.
Thank you, Kehinde. And that would be your last word. Any others?
Yes, I think just thank you so much, Reverend. I think the fear of women, and I think that's why in the teachings of the church, the women that are remembered are Jezebel, Delilah, particularly Jezebel and Delilah and Eve. Every single woman knows those three women, only because those are the women that showed how women have got power over men. And so they instill terror about women's mystique and power. And we never hear about Shipra, Puah, Zelophehad's daughters, other names in the Bible. Those three are entrenched so much in our psyche to create this fear, both in men and women, of the woman's power. And that is a theology of its own, through ensuring that those three names never die, and they are made to embody in a very negative way the reality that women do have power.
Thank you, Nontando. Any of the others? Stephanie, Faye, Francesca?
Sorry, so just my input into it. Well, for us in the Pacific, I think it's very culturally dangerous for us to say that it's the mistake of women, because what happens is it then focuses, the blame goes on to the women. And that's the dangerous part of it. When we start focusing and saying that, okay, maybe the issue is not the perpetrators, maybe it's because of the mystery behind her, maybe it's because she's powerful. But at the end of the day, I think what we need to focus on is how do we get to improve the situation of women on the ground. And I've heard a lot of the panelists speaking here about how culture keeps the silence, and that's right, and how even religion plays a part in it. how religion also puts down women. And then at least when we're going to be doing this webinar, one of the things that we want to focus on, at least to take out of here, is not only do you focus on trying to change the situation of one woman or group of women. I think structurally as a religious organization, like for the Pacific, Christianity is one of our major religions, and the church, it goes like this. It's the church, then your culture, then everything else underneath it. So when the church says jump, we ask how high. So that is one of the things. It's not only about focusing on trying to help one woman, it's about strengthening your structure in a way that it creates an enabling environment that women want to come and approach the church, that the women want to come and say, can you help me? Because if you have a structure in place and say that the Lord says, cometh and we will help, but the people that are put in place start saying, no, because you're not a submissive wife, I don't think you're a good Christian woman. Because you are not a virgin, I don't think you're a good wife because you didn't keep the purity ring with you. And that becomes very dangerous. It's important that we give it out to them and say, this is a safe place. And the cause is patriarchy, it's inequality. And that is what we need to break and smash at this moment. That is my last word.
Thank you, Faye. Thank you, Stephanie. Faye and Francesca?
Yeah, I can. Okay, please.
No, speak, Faye. I'll speak later.
Okay. I think I can't really add much to what Stephanie just said earlier because it applies a lot to our situation in Indonesia as well. Our country is actually quite superstitious, and I think similar to a lot of other countries in the regions that we're speaking about today, it's very diverse as well, which means, each area has a lot of their own superstitions, a lot of their own identity that's rooted in a lot of kind of cultural and religious factors that make it really interesting to see how women work in these systems. There are certain matrilineal societies in Indonesia that's very, very interesting, where women do kind of have an upper hand, but by and large, most of the time, women are expected to be, more submissive. There was a recent quote by actually the head of the police department about a year ago when he was lifted up to become the head of the police department. He said that as wives, women should live in the kasur dapur sumur, which means in the well, as in like getting water, in the kitchen and in the sheets. And this was a policeman, somebody who is very high up ranking. And it's things like this that is like, it's both cultural and structural in that way that women already set these expectations. And it's also, I don't think I can speak much to the mysticism aspect of it because it's different in every region, but no matter what, it always comes back to boiling down in women as a second-class citizen, almost as a second-class, participant in family matters and in other discussions as well.
Thank you, Faye. Francesca, the last word.
Okay. In Greece, we don't believe in this mystic power of woman. We don't connect here with this kind of power, but it is because our society was patriarchal for many centuries, and now we are trying to get over this. And the women were not economically independent, and now the situation is changing. So I think that men are threatened by this idea of powerful woman, and the 2 years of pandemic, and in combination with the economical crisis 5 years ago, put the situation of the abuse and of women in front.
Thank
so
you.
the problems that were underneath the prosperity the previous decades, and now with the crisis are in the front again.
Yes. So we have heard from our panelists. We know that the problem of sexual and gender-based violence, unfortunately, has no age limit. Faye mentioned children as young as 6 being victimized in her context. We know that there are barriers and increased mistrust, especially with the onset of any form of crisis within our contexts. We know that in the Pacific, 64% of women suffer violence at the hands of their partners. Nontando reminds us that although this is primarily against women, there is also the underlying issue of patriarchy, colonialism, and violence against sexual minorities in the LGBTQ community. Kehinde has offered a mind-blowing concept of ritualistic action, which is rooted and grounded in the mystique of women. And Stephanie counters that by saying to us, no, let's not create excuses, but let's deal with the problem at its root. Years ago, I remember a pastor saying to me that when you need to get rid of a coconut tree, the first thing you have to do is go to that very wide root system and chop all the way around, because only then can you prevent the coconut from springing to life again. There is a sense in which sexual and gender-based violence seems to be a coconut tree. And Francesca says to us that this is not a no problem. This is a long ago problem which has had far-reaching impact. We invite you to, in your small groups, unpack what you have heard, but more critically, spend the time for the next 15 to 17 minutes identifying ways in which we as church, Faye has thrown the challenge at us, as have our other panelists. How can we as church, as people of faith, reframe our cultures such that sexual and gender-based violence becomes a thing of the past that is declining rather than growing and growing even further than where we can see? I'm going to invite my colleague Sarah to spend a minute explaining to us the small group process. And for those of you who may or may not be watching live, I invite you to post your comments on our YouTube channel, because we will be harvesting those comments along with those made in the groups so that we can begin to actively engage together to make the difference we need to see. Each of us has been making a difference, but the problem continues to grow. Together, we can achieve more. Thank you to my panelists. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you. So as we have 15 minutes for our small group discussion, you will be automatically put into a group. There should be a panelist in each of the group who will help to facilitate this conversation, where we're reframing our approach as churches, as faith, to address sexual and gender-based violence. The interpreters will not be working during the breakout groups, so we hope that you facilitate any language issues. If there is a problem, you can send us a note, I believe. So if we're ready, I am opening all the rooms.
I'm sure that felt like the shortest 15 minutes of your life. But I am convinced that in our groups, we must have had some opportunity to think of practical approaches. I'm going to invite my panelists to join me again, or their representatives. It's easier for me to recognize the groups by the panelists. So as our panelists join me again, we will hear in a few. Kehinde, in 30 seconds, what was the key takeaway from your group for us to do? You're muted. Panelists, please all unmute.
the Pacific Conference of Churches, WADRA, I get this from me, which is also my own concept, partnership with theological institutions.
Partnership
with theological institutions. The World Council of Churches will generate a curriculum suggestion that will help theological institutions to have not necessarily a uniform, but contextualized instrument within the context of our curriculum in theological institutions.
Thank you so much.
So that pastors are taught in their schools.
Thank you so much. Stephanie.
Well, for our particular group, it had a wonderful discussion. And one of the things that at least came out strongly was, first and foremost, that the Bible needs to be interpreted, or the religious text needs to be interpreted the way that it was made, not to pick certain verses to meet the agenda of the person that is preaching or the person that is at the pulpit. The other is that the church needs to stand up strong, put their strength behind the injustice, and start speaking up for those that are going through gender-based violence. One of the things also, I just wanted to one more point, which is very important, is that that we shouldn't be using this particular stand for show, that it's about time that, just like what my previous panelist had said, it needs to be put into your curriculum. You need to build capacity from within the church so that they understand what is gender-based violence, and they'll also know how to understand and how to raise the awareness and counter it from the church and onwards. And it's also about your structures as well.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Faye?
Yeah, so we had a lot of the same things, first focusing on religious counseling and focusing on making sure that there's a biblically based foundation on the approach towards eradicating femicide. We also talked a lot about focusing on schools as well, so integrating this anti-trafficking and anti-patriarchal system into the way that we teach children and the way that we integrate them into our discussions.
Thank you so much. Francesca?
Yes, we think that we should reread the theological texts, the holy texts, in a modern way of view, with the collaboration of feminists, theologists.
Thank you. And Nontando?
I think most of the points have been raised, but we came up with ensuring that the theology is practical and that we build a whole church that is gender competent, that we have audits that check for policies that make it very clear that this is what the church stands for, so that they can advocate for justice and translate theology into practical programs throughout the church. Gender competent churches that embody and speak out.
Gender competent churches that embody and speak out. What I did not hear was a move for us to also accompany perpetrators. And I encourage us to think about that as one of the ways forward. As we seek to close this part of our conversation, and we will continue next week with the other half of the world in terms of the regions, I invite us to be aware of the fact that this is definitely not the end of the conversation. What we have simply done is begun to shine a flashlight so that we can become aware, and having raised awareness, move toward advocacy, activism, and hold ourselves accountable for the change that the world needs to see. It is easy for us to blame everybody else out there. And in our group, I remember one person saying that they were doing active work to rescue women in brothels. And my question in my head was, so who is it that visits the brothels? Are we doing work with them? just a thought for us to consider. We happen to be blessed with one of the leaders within the context of the World Council of Churches wider community in the form of His Eminence Metropolitan Seraphim Kyotos of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria and all Africa, including Zimbabwe. And as we seek to close this morning's, afternoon's, evening's conversation on the issue of femicide and ending sexual and gender-based violence, I invite you to lead us in prayer.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read one prayer from our book published by WCC. We are grateful for your leadership in this subject, as where there is any sort of violation in the church is a violation to the body of Christ. It's a violation to the Mother of God, Virgin Mary. We have to remember this, to consider ourselves responsible. Let's pray. We thank you for the presence of women, Almighty God, who in compassion sacrifice their welfare for the well-being of their loved ones. Yet we witness many women tortured, raped, kidnapped, and murdered, traumatized. They live in silence and feast. Oh, have mercy, Spirit of compassion, with the women whose bodies, lives, and families are torn apart by sexual violence. Spirit of love, bring healing to their bodies, their minds, and their spirits. Spirit of justice, embolden us to speak out against those who are raped as a weapon of war. Spirit of oneness, unifying us as we work to bring an end to violence against women and girls around the globe. Amen.
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 And so we thank you so very much for joining us. For had you not joined us as participants, we would have been speaking as panelists and planning teams to ourselves. We thank you. To my moderator who joined us, albeit late, Emmanuel Gabriel, to Lisa Hido, who is unavoidably absent. She has become ill. To Francesca, to Faye, to Kuleni, to Nontando, to Kehinde, and to Stephanie. We are so grateful to you for all you have done in sharing, just in brief, about the work that you are doing from across the globe and bringing that into our spaces so that we also might become agents of change. I want to especially thank our collaborating partners, the World YWCA, ACT Alliance, the LWF, Lutheran World Federation, and my colleagues here at the World Council of Churches who have all assisted in making this possible. Special thanks to my partners in the Pacific Council of Churches, Conference of Churches, who managed to be able to overcome some obstacles that were happening at the very last minute to ensure that Stephanie was able to speak with and to us. Ladies and gentlemen, the issue of femicide needs to be arrested now. And as Stephanie has said, we have to start with the religious groups, whether the church or at the mosque, and more so, it needs to begin with each of us. The blessings of God be with you. Special thanks to His Eminence. Have a wonderful day. Blessings.
Many thanks to you, Dr. Nicole. May God bless.
Thank you.